He didn't knock. The door to Serena Vale's apartment came off its hinges at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, and the man who walked through the splintered frame didn't hurry, didn't flinch at the noise, didn't look at the neighbor's lights clicking on down the hall. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Serena's rent for 6 months, and he had the kind of face that made you understand immediately, not through any particular expression, but through the total absence of one, that whatever you were about to say wouldn't matter. Behind him, two men in identical silence carried her brother Danny out of his bedroom by his arms. Danny was 20 years old, still in his socks, and he didn't scream because the hand across his mouth made screaming impossible. Serena threw herself at the man in the suit. He caught her wrist without looking at her. "Miss Vale," he said, "Mr. Viscari will see you now." If you were in that hallway, if those were your brother's eyes above that stranger's hand, what would you have done? If you're watching right now, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And stay until the very end, because what happens to Serena inside that estate is something nobody saw coming. Not even herself. Part 1. The debt notice had arrived 3 weeks earlier in a plain white envelope with no return address. Serena had almost thrown it away. She got junk mail constantly. Collection notices for her father's old medical bills, credit card offers, the occasional hand-addressed thing from someone who'd known her dad back when knowing him still felt like a good idea. She'd gotten good at sorting through the pile on the kitchen counter without letting any of it actually land in her chest. But this one had her full legal name on it. Not Serena, not S. Vale. Serena Marie Vale, written out in a thin, precise hand that didn't look like a computer had produced it. She'd opened it standing at the counter in her work clothes, still carrying her bag, and read it twice before she understood what she was reading. Then she'd sat down on the floor because her legs stopped working. The letter stated in 4 clean paragraphs that her late father, Raymond Vale, had accumulated a debt of $840,000 with an organization referred to only as the Viscari Group. It stated that this debt had been purchased from a third party. It stated that under the terms of the original agreement, the debt transferred to his estate upon death, and in the absence of liquid assets in that estate, to his surviving dependents. Serena was 24. She worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Lower Manhattan. She made $41,000 a year before taxes and shared a 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria with her brother Danny, who was enrolled at Queens College on a partial scholarship and who bussed tables on weekends to cover the gap. $840,000. She'd called the number at the bottom of the letter. A man with a flat, bored voice told her a representative would be in touch. She'd asked what organization this was. The man had said, "Someone will explain everything," and hung up. That was 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, Serena had done what she always did when she didn't know what else to do. She'd worked. She'd stayed late at the office, filed every motion on time, answered every email, brought coffee to partners who didn't bother to thank her. She'd told Danny nothing. She'd told herself it was a scam, that it would resolve itself, that her father, whatever else Raymond Vale had been, and he had been a lot of things, most of them disappointing, hadn't been stupid enough to borrow nearly $1 million from anyone. She'd almost believed it. Then Tuesday night happened, and the door came off the hinges, and a man in a black suit caught her wrist in the hallway of her apartment, and Serena Vale's careful, controlled, completely manageable life ended. The car was a black Mercedes with tinted windows and no visible plates. Serena sat in the back between 2 men she'd never seen before, with Danny's hand in hers. They'd released his mouth once they were in the elevator, and her brother had spent the ride down to the street shaking so hard his teeth clicked, and she looked out the window at the lights of Queens scrolling past and tried to think. She was a paralegal. She knew things about law, about process, about what was legal and what wasn't. She knew that what was happening to her had no legal basis whatsoever. She knew that in any functioning court of law, a debt incurred by a deceased parent did not transfer to adult children who hadn't co-signed anything. She also knew, looking at the 2 men sitting beside her in the car, that courts had nothing to do with this. Danny pressed his shoulder against hers. He was taller than her, had been since he was 15, but in the dark of the car he felt small. "Serena," he whispered. "Don't talk," one of the men said. Not loud, not angry, just final. Danny shut his mouth. Serena squeezed his hand once and kept her eyes on the window. They crossed into Manhattan and drove north, then east again, through neighborhoods that grew progressively quieter until the car pulled through an iron gate set into a long stone wall and the city disappeared entirely. The estate inside the wall was enormous. She could see the shape of it, the lit windows across 3 stories, the gravel drive, the dark shapes of men stationed near the entrance. It looked like money that didn't need to announce itself. Old money, or money that had been around long enough to develop the mannerisms of old money. She was pulled out of the car and walked through the front entrance with Danny's arm gripped by the man in the suit, and the message of that arrangement was unmistakable. Danny was the leverage, and she was the one being given a choice. The interior was as cold as the exterior suggested. High ceilings, dark wood. A staircase that curved upward to somewhere she couldn't see. There were no decorations that looked personal, no photographs, no color, nothing that said someone actually lived here rather than operated from here. They walked her into a study off the main hall and left Danny in the hallway with 2 guards. Serena heard the door close behind her. Cassian Viscari was standing at the window with his back to her. She'd had 3 weeks to form an image in her mind of what the man behind the letter might look like, and none of those images had prepared her for the reality. He was taller than she expected, broader through the shoulders, and he stood with the particular stillness of a person who had never in his adult life been required to make himself smaller in a room. He was looking out at the dark garden below the window, and he didn't turn when she came in. She stood in the middle of the room and waited. "Your father," he said finally, "was a careful man." She hadn't expected him to start there. "My father was a lot of things." He turned then, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, with features that might have been considered handsome if they ever arranged themselves into anything warmer than controlled calculation. His eyes were very dark and they moved over her with a flatness that wasn't contempt exactly, more like assessment, like she was information he was processing. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "The letter said my father owed you money." The letter, he said, was simplified for clarity. He moved to the desk and sat down across from where she stood, which told her something about his confidence, that he'd sit while she stood, that he wasn't worried about what she might do. "Your father owed a debt. The debt is now yours. I have a proposal." "I don't have $800,000. "I know." "Then your proposal is based on a premise that Miss Vale—" His voice hadn't risen, hadn't sharpened. It stayed exactly as level as it had been, and somehow that was worse than volume would have been. "I know you don't have the money. The proposal isn't about money." She waited. "I need a wife," he said. "For 1 year. A legal marriage, a public arrangement, presence at specific events, and complete discretion about anything you see or hear inside this organization. At the end of 1 year, you will be released from the agreement, the debt will be cleared, and you and your brother will be provided with resources that will make your previous financial situation seem laughable." The room was very quiet. Serena was aware, in the way you become aware of things when the bottom drops out, of the exact weight of the air around her. "You're serious," she said. "I don't make proposals I'm not serious about." "Why me?" It wasn't a question exactly, more like a requirement. She needed him to answer it, needed to understand the logic, because without the logic, the whole thing was just violence with paperwork attached. He looked at her for a moment. "Your father left something behind, something that belongs to people who want it back. I need time to find it before they do. A wife provides certain social and legal protections that a business arrangement does not. You were chosen because your connection to what was left behind makes you the most logical choice. And if I say no..." The answer came without hesitation. "Your brother is currently in the hallway. The men with him have instructions that depend on your answer." Serena had always considered herself a rational person. She'd grown up in a household that ran on the chaos of Raymond Vale's choices. The missed rent payments, the borrowed money, the optimism that never quite matched the arithmetic. And she'd developed, as a result, the habit of staying calm when other people panicked. It was one of the things she was genuinely good at. She was not calm now, but she kept her face even, and she breathed through it, and she said, "What exactly would this marriage require?" He told her. The terms were specific. She would live in the estate. She would attend events as his wife. She would sign a legal marriage certificate. She would not contact law enforcement, would not disclose organizational information, would not attempt to leave the estate without clearance. In exchange, Danny would be untouched, enrolled in any university of his choosing come the fall semester, and provided a monthly stipend. The debt would be dissolved. At the end of 12 months, she would be free. She stood in the middle of his study for a long moment after he finished. "I want to see my brother before I answer," she said. He considered this. Then he said, "Marco," toward the door, and a moment later Danny was brought in. He looked terrified. He also looked, when his eyes found hers, immediately steadier. That had always been the thing between them, the way seeing each other could recalibrate something. She crossed the room and put her hand on his jaw, and he leaned into it like he was 12 again. "You okay?" she said low. "They didn't hurt me." His voice was tight. "Serena, what is this? Who is this guy?" "I'm handling it." "What does that mean?" "Danny." She made him look at her. "I'm handling it. Trust me." He didn't trust her. She could see it in his face, the way he wanted to argue, the way the argument died, because he also, underneath everything, did trust her, had always trusted her, which was its own particular kind of terrible right now. "Serena, go with the man who brought you in," she said. "I'll be done soon." She turned back to Cassian Viscari, and she looked at him across the room, and she said, "Yes." The wedding happened 9 days later. Not in a church, in the estate's own formal hall, which had been fitted with what passed for ceremony, candles, a justice of the peace who arrived and departed without making eye contact with anyone, and 2 witnesses Serena had never met who signed their names to the certificate and were gone within 20 minutes. She wore a cream-colored dress that someone had brought to her room the morning of, in her exact size, which was the detail that unnerved her more than anything else about the day. That he'd known her size, that someone had checked, that the machine of this organization had already processed her down to her measurements before she'd agreed to anything. Danny wasn't there. That had been the one piece of the arrangement that she'd fought. She'd pushed for him to be present, and Cassian had declined without explanation, and she hadn't had the leverage to press it. She'd signed the certificate alone, with strangers around her, in a house that smelled like old stone and something chemical underneath that she couldn't identify. Cassian had stood beside her in his dark suit and said what he was required to say, and signed where he was required to sign, and then the justice was gone and the witnesses were gone, and there was a dinner that neither of them ate much of, and then Serena was shown to a room on the 2nd floor that was larger than her entire apartment in Astoria and told that it was hers. She sat on the edge of the bed in the cream dress for a long time after the door closed. She wasn't crying. She was too deep past the point of crying. She was sitting with the specific weight of having made the only choice available and still not knowing if it was right. She thought about her father, Raymond Vale, who had been charming and unreliable and sometimes wonderful and mostly absent, who had died of a coronary in a motel room outside of Newark 18 months ago with $40 in his wallet and no explanation for any of it. She thought about the letter that had come after his death, the things that hadn't added up. The hospital bills that were smaller than they should have been for a man who'd supposedly been gambling for years, the complete absence of any actual debt records from the casinos her father supposedly frequented. She'd noticed those things at the time and filed them as grief brain, as the kind of overanalysis that comes from trying to make order out of a person's senseless end. She wasn't so sure now. There was a knock at her door at 10 in the evening. She opened it expecting one of the staff. It was Cassian. He was still in his suit, jacket off now, and he had 2 glasses of something amber in one hand, which was strange enough to take her off guard. He held one out. She didn't take it immediately. "What do you want?" "I thought you might have questions," he said. "You thought right." She took the glass. Didn't drink from it. "What was my father hiding?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We don't know exactly. We know it's documentation of some kind. Financial records or communications. Something that was given to him for safekeeping by a man who died shortly after, and something that multiple organizations have been trying to locate for nearly a decade. My father didn't have anything like that. I went through his things after he died. His whole life fit into 3 boxes. He was careful," Cassian said again. "Whatever it is, he didn't keep it in any place obvious." Serena turned the glass in her hands. "You said organizations, plural." "Yes." "Are you one of them? Looking for it?" He met her eyes. "I'm trying to find it before the ones who killed your father do." The room went very still. Serena felt something shift, not in her understanding, not yet, but in the architecture of what she thought she'd understood. My father died of a heart attack. Your father, Cassian said carefully, was help toward that outcome. She set the glass down on the dresser because her hand was not entirely steady anymore. She looked at him, and he looked back, and she understood that this man, this cold, controlled, unreachable man she had just legally married in front of strangers, was telling her the truth. She didn't know how she knew it. She knew it anyway. Who? She said. That's what I'm trying to determine. And you think I can help you find whatever he hid? I think, he said, that if anyone can, it's you. She looked at him for a long time. He didn't shift, didn't look away, didn't offer anything more than he'd already given. The candles from the hall had been extinguished hours ago, and the corridor behind him was dark, and in the low light of the bedroom, he looked like exactly what he was. A man who had survived a long time by knowing things other people didn't and keeping those things locked somewhere behind his face. She had married him. She had married him, and her father was murdered, and there was something hidden somewhere that she was apparently the only person who could find, and her brother was in a room somewhere in this building, sleeping or not sleeping with guards outside his door, and in 12 months she was supposed to walk out of here free. Serena Vale picked up the glass and took a long drink. You should know, she said, that I'm not going to make this easy for you. Something moved across his face, not a smile. She didn't think he smiled. Something more like the recognition that this situation had become marginally more complicated than he'd planned for. I assume that, he said. He took the glass back from her, finished what was left in it, and walked out without another word. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the estate grounds below. The high walls, the guards at their stations, the iron gate at the end of the drive. And she started very quietly to think. Her father had been murdered. She was inside the house of the man who claimed to be trying to find out why. And somewhere in the rubble of Raymond Vale's small, scattered, endlessly complicated life, there was something worth killing for. She was going to find it first. She didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. Serena had always been a bad sleeper, had spent half her childhood lying awake listening to her father come home at hours that didn't make sense, parsing the sound of his footsteps on the stairs for information about what kind of night it had been. But this was different. This was the specific sleeplessness of a person who understood with total clarity that the walls around her were not metaphorical. She lay on top of the covers in the cream dress because she hadn't thought to ask where her clothes were, and she stared at the ceiling of the bedroom, which was high and ornate and utterly indifferent to her. And she went through everything Cassian had told her. Her father had been murdered. She kept returning to it, not because she couldn't believe it. She could, actually, which was its own disturbing revelation, but because of what it meant about everything that came before. Every time she'd written Raymond Vale off as reckless or careless or just constitutionally incapable of handling his own life, she had been operating on incomplete information. The gambling debts, the absent years, the dying broke in a motel outside Newark. If those were covers, if he had been hiding something that people killed for, then she had spent the last decade being angry at a man for choices he may not have had the freedom to make. That thought sat in her chest like something with weight. At 4 a.m, she got up, washed her face in the bathroom, marble, enormous, stocked with products she didn't recognize, and changed into a robe she found hanging behind the door. Then she sat at the writing desk near the window and started making a list from memory of everything her father had left behind. 3 boxes. She'd gone through them herself. Box 1. Clothes, a broken watch, a paperback novel with the spine cracked, a photograph of her mother from before she left. Box 2. Mail, mostly unopened, and a few receipts, a Newark Public Library card that had expired 4 years earlier. Box 3. The thing she'd almost missed, wedged into a false bottom she'd only found because the box had seemed heavier than it should, a small leather notebook with nothing in it but a series of numbers that hadn't meant anything to her at the time, so she'd put it in the back of her underwear drawer and eventually stopped thinking about it. She stopped writing. She was thinking about it now. The estate woke early. She could hear it through the walls and floor, footsteps, doors, the low percussion of a place that operated on a schedule even before the sun came up. At 6:30, someone knocked on her bedroom door, and a woman she hadn't seen before left a tray of coffee and food on the hall table without being invited in, without saying anything except, "Mr. Vescari asks that you be downstairs by 8." Serena drank the coffee standing up. She found her clothes, her actual clothes from the apartment, hanging in the wardrobe, which meant someone had been to Astoria without her knowledge, and that information delivered its own particular chill. She dressed it in what she'd worn to work the day before everything fell apart. Black trousers, a gray blouse, the kind of outfit that said, "I am professional and I am not here for any of this." Downstairs, Cassian was at the long dining table with a man she hadn't seen the night before. The man was heavy-set, in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of permanently flushed complexion that suggested either high blood pressure or a drinking problem. He was talking when she came in and stopped the instant he saw her. The silence lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. "This is Marco Thierry," Cassian said, without looking up from whatever he was reading. "He runs internal operations." Thierry stood, extended his hand. His grip was firm in the particular way that men use handshakes to establish things. "Mrs. Vescari," he said. Serena shook his hand and felt his eyes moving over her face with an attention that was not quite what he was pretending it was. "Ms. Vale," she said. "I kept my name." A beat. Thierry glanced at Cassian, who still hadn't looked up. "Of course," Thierry said, and sat back down. Serena poured herself coffee from the carafe on the sideboard and sat at the opposite end of the table from both of them. She had decided, sometime around 5 in the morning, that the worst thing she could do in this situation was act like a captive. She was going to behave like a person who had made a business arrangement, which was, technically, what had happened. "I'd like to see my brother this morning," she said. "After 9, Cassian said. "I'd like to see him now." He looked up then, met her eyes across the length of the table. Whatever he was reading, he set it face down. "After 9, he said again, and his voice had that same total flatness as the night before, the particular tone of a man who had never repeated himself and was mildly interested to discover he was doing it now. "He's still sleeping. I'd still like to—" "After 9, Ms. Vale." Thierry was watching this exchange with an expression he was working hard to keep neutral. Serena drank her coffee. Danny was in a room on the ground floor at the east end of the building, which she noted for reasons she didn't examine too closely. He was awake when she got there at 9:02, sitting on the edge of the bed in the clothes he'd been taken in, scrolling through his phone with the tense, rapid movements of someone checking every possible source of information simultaneously. He looked up when she came in, and the relief on his face made her want to put her fist through the wall. "You okay?" she said. "I've been better." He stood up. He was pale under his usual coloring, shadows beneath his eyes. "Serena, what did you agree to?" "They won't tell me anything. Nobody will say anything. There's a guy outside my door who just stares. I got us out of the debt situation." "By doing what?" She looked at him. He was 20 years old and he was scared and he deserved honesty, and she was going to give him as much of it as she safely could. "I'm going to stay here for a while. A year. It's a formal arrangement. There are terms. It's complicated, but it's legal, and you're going to be fine." "You married him." He'd put it together already. She could see it in his face, the way the pieces had clicked into something coherent and wrong. "Oh my God, Serena, it's an arrangement, a legal one. It has an end date. That's not—" He pushed his hand through his hair. "That is not okay. That's not something that's okay. You can't just—" "What was the alternative?" She kept her voice level. "Walk away and what? They take the debt to court?" "They don't take things to court, Danny. That's not how this works." "How do you know how this works?" "I know enough." He sat back down, put his face in his hands. She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he let her, which told her how bad it was. Danny hadn't let her comfort him since he was 15, and decided that being consoled by his older sister was beneath his dignity. "Listen to me," she said. "I need you to do something." He looked up. "I need you to go back to the apartment. Get the notebook from the back of the drawer in my room. The leather one, small, with numbers in it. Don't look at it. Don't photograph it. Don't tell anyone you have it. Bring it here when you come back." He stared at her. Am I leaving?" "They'll take you home today." She hoped that was true. She believed it was true because Cassian had said it, and whatever else he was, she had the impression that he kept his word. Not from ethics, but from the kind of operational logic that understood broken promises were bad for business. Come back tomorrow. Visiting is part of the arrangement. Bring the notebook. What's in it? I don't know yet. He studied her face. You think this is about Dad? It wasn't a question, which meant he'd had thoughts of his own. She filed that away. What makes you say that? Because nothing about the last 2 years has made sense. The way he died, the bills, There was no body, Serena. They cremated him and shipped us the ashes before we could even request to see anything. I thought it was just how things happened when someone dies alone and broke and nobody's paying attention, but he stopped. It wasn't that, was it? She held his gaze. No, she said quietly. I don't think it was. The room absorbed that. Danny sat with it for a moment, and she watched him, really watched him, and saw something settle in him that she recognized because she'd felt it herself sometime around 4 in the morning. The specific grief of revising your understanding of a dead person, of having to build them back from scratch. Get me the notebook, she said. He nodded. What she hadn't anticipated was Lucian. She met him that afternoon, and within 45 minutes she understood that he was the most dangerous person in the building. That wasn't obvious at first. It wasn't written on his face the way it was on Cassian's, didn't announce itself through stillness or controlled menace. Lucien Armand was 51 years old, and he was warm. That was the word for it. He was warm in the way of a man who understood exactly how to make other people feel seen, who had developed charm into something more precise than charm, a tool, honed and intentional. He found her in the library on the second floor, where she'd gone after Danny left, where she was working through the shelves with no particular plan except to understand the space she was living in. You must be the new Mrs. Vescari, he said from the doorway. Ms. Vale. She'd said it twice today. She was committing to it. He smiled, warm, genuine seeming, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. Of course. I'm Lucien. I practically raised our Cassian, so you could call me family, though I imagine that word is complicated in this context. He came into the room with the ease of a man who had never been uncomfortable anywhere. How are you finding it? It's a large house, she said. It is. He settled into one of the leather chairs near the window without being invited, the way people do when they've decided the space is partly theirs. He hasn't explained everything to you yet. He's explained some things. About your father, I imagine. She kept her face even. Why would you know what he's explained to me? Lucien smiled again. I know most things that happen in this house. It's my job, too. He crossed one leg over the other, perfectly at ease. I want you to know, Ms. Vale, that I'm an ally. Cassian trusts very few people and tells the rest of them almost nothing. I've been in this organization since he was 19 years old. If you need someone to translate what he isn't saying, I'm available. She looked at him. He had gray at his temples and kind eyes and hands that were completely still in his lap. He looked like someone's well-traveled uncle, the kind who brought interesting gifts and always knew which wine to order. I'll keep that in mind, she said. She did not trust him. She couldn't have explained it then. There was no single thing wrong, no specific tell. It was something in the architecture of his warmth, the way it was present everywhere equally, like a coat of paint rather than something that lived underneath. Genuine warmth had variation. It showed up more in some moments than others, got thin at the edges when people were tired or distracted. Lucien's warmth was consistent in a way that suggested manufacture. She found Cassian 40 minutes later and said, Your brother came to introduce himself. Something shifted in Cassian's face. It was small. She almost missed it, but it was there. Where? Library. He said he practically raised you. A pause. He did. He offered to translate things you weren't telling me. Did he? The flatness in Cassian's voice had a new quality now. Not quite sharp, but denser. He was looking at the far wall and not at her, which she was already learning meant he was running calculations behind his expression. What did you tell him? That I'd keep it in mind. She paused. Should I be worried about him? Cassian met her eyes. You should be careful about everyone in this building. Including you? The pause this time was longer. Especially me, he said. The poisoned dinner happened on the 12th day. She didn't know it was poisoned while she was eating it. She found out afterward, when she was in the bathroom at 2 in the morning, with her body trying to evacuate everything she'd consumed in the past 48 hours. And Cassian came through the door without knocking, which was, she noted through the haze of nausea, becoming his signature move, and crouched beside her on the cold marble floor with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. It looked like anger, but it was pointed inward. "Don't touch anything else in this room," he said. He was on his phone before he finished the sentence, speaking in a low, fast Italian she couldn't follow. She sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub and her hair sticking to her face and said, "What was in the food?" "We don't know yet." He looked at her, really looked, in a way that catalogued her, assessed her, measured what he was seeing against some internal scale. "How bad?" "I've been better." She'd said that before, she realized. Those had been Danny's words in his room, and now they were hers on this floor, which felt like the universe making a point. "What are the odds it was meant for me specifically?" "Lower than the odds it was meant for me." He sat on the floor beside her, which was unexpected enough that she blinked at him. A man like Cassian Vescari sitting on a bathroom floor was not a thing she'd constructed as possible. "The household staff prepares my food. Mine and now yours. Someone accessed the kitchen." "That means it's internal." "Yes." "That means you have a problem inside your own organization." "I've had that problem for some time." He said it with a flatness that held, somewhere underneath, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been managing an impossible situation for too long and is tired of the management. Tonight changes the parameters. A medical person arrived within 20 minutes. She never got his name. And she was assessed, given something to drink that tasted like nothing, and settled her stomach within an hour, and told she would be fine. When she was back in bed, propped against the headboard and still feeling hollow and wrung out, Cassian stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her. "Your moving rooms," he said. "To where?" "Mine." She stared at him. "Adjacent," he said. "There's a connecting door. It's more defensible than this wing." He had the air of someone explaining a logistics decision, which was either the most unromantic thing she'd encountered in her life or, given the context, entirely reasonable. She hadn't decided. "I need to be able to reach you. Because I'm useful to you." He didn't answer that the way she expected. He said, "Because someone tried to kill my wife and I'd rather they not succeed." The word wife sat oddly in the air between them. It was the first time he'd used it. She moved rooms the next morning. The security footage discovery happened on day 19, and it was an accident. She'd been going through the library systematically by then, not looking for anything specific, just reading, absorbing, trying to understand the history of the organization she'd married into, through the documents and books that someone had decided were safe to shelve publicly. Most of it was dry. Financial records, legal filings, things that told her how the Vescari Group had transformed over 30 years from a small protection operation in Lower Manhattan into something that had its hands in a dozen legitimate industries as covers. She'd found the access panel because a book fell. Specifically, she'd been reaching for a volume on the high shelf, misjudged the weight of it, and the cascade that followed knocked 4 books onto the floor and shifted the panel concealed behind them approximately 3 inches to the left. She would have dismissed it, would have pushed it back and thought nothing of it, except that the edge of a screen was visible in the gap, and the screen had an image on it that stopped her entirely. The footage was from a camera positioned somewhere in the East Corridor, dated 31 days prior. It showed a man she didn't recognize entering what appeared to be a private office, removing a file from a drawer, photographing each page with a phone, and replacing it with no indication of rush. He worked methodically, deliberately, like someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The footage was continuous. 22 minutes. She watched all of it before she heard footsteps in the hall and pushed the panel shut and moved back to the table with a book open in front of her, her heart working harder than she wanted it to. She needed to tell Cassian. She knew that. She also needed, first, to figure out why someone had been watching that footage without reporting it, because the panel was hidden, and hidden panels with functioning screens implied someone was monitoring something that they didn't want discovered. That night, at dinner, she watched Thierry. He was at the table with them. He usually was, apparently, part of the daily structure of the estate. And he was easy and talkative the way he usually was, asking Cassian about a business matter in Rotterdam, commenting on the wine, directing 2 or 3 questions at Serena with what appeared to be genuine friendliness. She watched his hands. She watched his eyes when Cassian wasn't looking at him. She saw it once, briefly. A flicker of attention toward the corridor, timed precisely to when a staff member passed the dining room door. She filed it, said nothing. That night she told Cassian about the footage, leaving out the part about the hidden panel and leaving in every other detail. She told him what the man looked like, what he'd taken, the date. Cassian's face did the thing it did when he was calculating. Then he said, "Stay in your room tonight." "What are you going to—" "Stay in your room." She did. She heard something at 1 in the morning, not loud, the house was thick-walled, but she heard a door, and then voices that weren't raised exactly, but had an urgency that traveled through the walls, and then nothing for a long time, and then steps going somewhere fast. She stayed where she was. In the morning, she came downstairs, and one of the men who usually took a position near the east entrance was absent, not on leave. Absent in the way of someone who had been there yesterday and would not be there again, whose absence everyone around the table was carefully not discussing. Thierry was buttering toast with the focused attention of a man who had decided to be very interested in toast. Cassian caught her eye across the table and held it for a moment, and she understood. He'd found the person in the footage, and the matter had been resolved in a way that she didn't require the details of, and she should eat her breakfast. She ate her breakfast. She was shaking slightly, which she hid by keeping her hands below the table. The sniper happened on day 24. She was in the car, Cassian's car, the black Mercedes, returning from what had been described to her as a necessary public appearance. A dinner at a restaurant in Midtown, where she'd sat beside her husband and smiled at men whose names she hadn't been given and whose business she understood without it being explained. She'd worn a black dress that someone had selected for her and pearl earrings, and she'd held Cassian's hand when he offered it at the table and kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman who was exactly where she chose to be. She'd been better at it than expected. They were 2 blocks from the estate when the window exploded. The sound was enormous and intimate at once, a concussion that seemed to come from inside her skull rather than outside it. And then she was sideways across the back seat because Cassian's arm had come across her chest and taken her down, his full weight on top of her. And there was glass in her hair and her ears were ringing and the car was accelerating with a violence that pushed them both further into the seat. She couldn't hear anything properly. She could feel his breathing, fast, controlled, pressed against the top of her head where he was holding her down. She could feel him check himself, one hand moving quickly across his own side, looking for damage. She put her hand on his arm. "Are you hit?" His answer was a second too slow. "No." You paused. "I'm fine." "Cassian, I'm fine." He lifted himself off her, and she saw immediately that his left hand was pressed against his ribs, that the jacket was dark there in a way that wasn't the fabric. She grabbed his wrist. "That is not fine. It's a graze." He looked at her face, her actual face, studied it, and said, "You're not hit." "No." She pulled his hand away enough to see. It was more than a graze. Not catastrophic, but not nothing either, and he'd been lying about it since the moment it happened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because telling you serves no immediate function. I'm right here, and I needed you to stay down and not move, which required your cooperation, which required you to believe I was uninjured." He said this without apology, without any particular inflection. Information. Calculation. This is what I did, and this is why. She held the dark sleeve of his jacket and looked at him and felt something she didn't have a name for. Not sympathy exactly, not attraction, something harder to categorize than either of those. The recognition of a person who operates by the same logic she did. Triage first, everything else after. She pressed his hand back against the wound. "Hold that." He held it. The car stopped inside the estate gate and people came, and he was taken somewhere to be dealt with by someone who knew what they were doing, and Serena stood on the gravel drive in the dress and the pearl earrings with glass still in her hair and looked at the dark windows of the building around her and thought, this is the second attempt in 10 days. Whoever was doing this was not deterred, and they were getting better at it. She found the notebook on day 26. Danny brought it on his 3rd visit, tucked into his jacket pocket, handed to her during what she'd begun calling library time, the hour each afternoon where she and Danny were permitted to sit together in the second-floor library with the understanding that this was a sanctioned arrangement, that someone was outside the door, that the window behind them faced the interior courtyard. She waited until he'd left before she opened it. The numbers ran in columns down 5 pages. No letters, no labels, no key. Each row was 8 digits, and there were 43 rows, and she sat with it for a long time going through the patterns before she saw it. The first 2 digits of each row were a year. She recognized it once she stopped looking for codes and looked instead for information. Her father's way of thinking, which had never been linear but had always been logical underneath the apparent chaos. Years, 1994 through 2021. A record. The next 6 digits were consistent within each year's rows in a way that suggested account numbers, case numbers, something structured. She needed more to go on. She needed access to something she didn't have. She needed Cassian. She didn't go to him immediately. She spent 2 more days with the notebook, committing the numbers to memory before telling him anything, because she was living in his house and wearing his name in public and sleeping behind a door connected to his room, and she'd learned enough by now to understand that information, in this world, was the only currency she actually controlled. On day 28, she went to his office and knocked. He said, "Come in," without looking up. She sat across from him. He hadn't offered. She sat anyway. And she put the notebook on the desk and said, "I found what my father hid." The calculation that moved across his face was rapid, and she could see it, could trace it, included the specific recalculation of how much he had underestimated her. She watched him revise his assessment of the last 28 days in real time, and she didn't let herself feel pleased about it because the moment was too consequential for that. "When?" he said. "Day 26. "You waited 2 days. I needed to understand it first." He looked at the notebook. Then he looked at her. "You didn't trust me with it." "I still don't," she said. "Fully. But I need your resources to decode the second half, and you need me to have found this, so." She pushed the notebook toward him. "We have the same problem. That makes us useful to each other." He picked up the notebook. She watched him read through the first page, watched his expression, and saw it. There, sudden and controlled almost instantly, a flash of something she could only call recognition. He'd seen something on that page he knew. "What is it?" she said. He closed the notebook, set it on the desk, looked at her with an attention that was different from any he'd directed at her before. Not the assessment of the first night, not the calculation of the weeks after. Something more direct. "Some of these numbers," he said carefully, "correspond to accounts I've been trying to locate for 4 years. "Whose accounts?" The pause he gave her then was longer than any pause she'd gotten from him yet. "The people who built this organization before I inherited it," he said. "The people who murdered my parents." The office was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the estate, a door slammed, sharp and hard, loud enough to carry through walls. And they both registered it simultaneously, and Cassian was out of his chair before the echo finished. Marco Thierry was standing in the hallway with his coat on, and his face the color of old paper, and behind him, breathing hard, was one of the external security team with a radio in his hand. And the man said, "There's been a breach, sir. East perimeter. Whoever it was got in and out clean, and—" He stopped. "And," Cassian said, "they left something. In the courtyard. It's—" Another stop, and this one had fear in it, real fear, the kind that didn't perform. "It's addressed to her." He meant Serena. She stepped forward before anyone could stop her. On the stone bench in the center of the courtyard, in a waterproof envelope, was a single sheet of paper. She opened it with hands that were steady because she made them steady, and read it in the gray afternoon light and felt the ground shift beneath her. It said, "He already knows where the evidence leads. The question is whether he'll let you live long enough to find out he's known all along." She turned and looked at Cassian through the glass doors of the estate entrance. He was watching her from across the courtyard with his hands at his sides and his face completely still. And he didn't ask what the note said. And he didn't move toward her. And she stood in the cold with the paper in her hand and understood, with the shattering, precise clarity of someone who has just had their entire revised framework revised again, that the man she had been beginning, against every rational instinct to trust, might have known things about her father's death from the very beginning. And if he had, if this was true, then nothing about the last 28 days was what she'd believed it to be. She walked back inside. That was the first decision. Not to stand in the courtyard holding the note while Cassian watched her through the glass. Not to let the distance between them become a tableau that told him something about how badly it had landed. She folded the paper once, put it in the pocket of her trousers, and came through the door with her shoulders straight and her face arranged into an expression that gave him nothing. He was still watching her. Thierry was to his left, the security man to his right, and the three of them occupied the entrance hall in a formation that would have looked, to anyone observing, like concern. She understood it differently. She understood it as a structure. Cassian at the center, the others flanking, a closed system with its own internal logic that she was not part of and had never been part of, and the note in her pocket was either a lie designed to fracture something that had been carefully, incrementally building between them, or it was a truth that recontextualized everything. She did not know which. That not knowing was the most dangerous thing in the room. "What does it say?" Cassian said. She looked at him, looked at Thierry, looked back. "I'd like to speak with you alone," she said. Thierry's expression didn't change. That, she'd learned, was its own kind of information. A man who never reacted to being excluded was a man who expected to find out anyway. Cassian said, "Marco," and Thierry left without being told twice. The security man followed. They were alone in the entrance hall, and the house was very quiet around them, and Cassian was waiting with the particular patience of someone who has trained himself not to push, who understands that waiting is its own form of pressure. She took the note from her pocket and held it out. He read it standing, didn't reach for it, just looked at it in her hand. His eyes moved across the single line twice, she counted, and then he looked up at her. "Who do you think sent it?" he said. "I don't know yet, but I want to know what it means." "It means someone is trying to create a rupture between us." "That's one possibility." She kept her eyes on his face. "Here's another. You've known since before I got here what my father's records connect to, and you brought me inside this house because I was the only person who could retrieve them for you, and everything since, the dinners, the explanations, the night on the bathroom floor, was management." The word landed. She watched it land. Cassian was still. He was always still. But this was a different quality of stillness, the kind that preceded something rather than following it. "You think I knew your father was murdered before I brought you here," he said. "Did you?" The pause he gave her was exactly one breath long. "Yes." The entrance hall did not move. The walls did not move. Serena did not move. "How long?" she said. 14 months. 14 months. He had known for 14 months, 3 months before she'd gotten the letter, 11 months before the wedding, nearly a full year of knowing while she'd been in her apartment in Astoria, believing her father had died of a heart attack in a motel room, while she'd been angry at a dead man for all his human failures. "You used me," she said. "Yes." It was the yes that made it hard to breathe. Not a qualification, not an explanation leading somewhere softer, just yes, direct and without apology. Because this was a man who had decided somewhere along the line that honesty, when finally given, should be complete. "The debt was fabricated," she said. "Yes." "You fabricated it." "I acquired the vehicle through which to approach you, yes. The debt structure was already in place. Someone else built it. I bought the claim and used it as a means of contact." Contact. She repeated the word the way you repeat a word when the actual content of it is too large to process immediately. "You had my brother dragged out of his bedroom. I needed you to take the situation seriously." "You needed—" She stopped. The thing in her chest was not grief, and it was not rage, and it was something between them that had no clean name, that was built from the specific humiliation of having extended trust incrementally over 28 days to a person who had been running a calculation on her since before she knew he existed. "You needed," she said again, more quietly. "And Danny was the easiest lever." "Yes." She turned away from him, walked to the far side of the entrance hall and stood with her back to him and breathed. And this was not something she wanted to do in front of him, but the alternative was letting him see her face, which she was not willing to do. She heard him cross the room. He stopped somewhere behind her. Not close, not crowding, at a distance that she understood was deliberate. "The note is half true," he said. "I knew the records would lead somewhere significant. I didn't know the specific contents. That's the truth. The distinction matters. It doesn't matter to me right now. I know. Stop agreeing with me. A pause. All right. She turned back around. He was 6 feet away, hands at his sides, watching her with that same direct attention that she'd cataloged over the past weeks, and had started to mistake for something it apparently wasn't. What do the numbers connect to? She said. Accounts maintained by the 3 families who controlled organized crime in this city for 40 years before I took over. Accounts used to fund operations I've spent a decade trying to document. Your father was given those records by a man named Gabriel Soren, who worked as an accountant for those families for 20 years before he understood what exactly he was accounting for. For Soren died 2 months after he gave your father the notebook. Your father kept it hidden for 9 years and told no one, including you, because Soren told him the information would only be safe if it was completely inert. She held his gaze. And Soren's death. Made to look like a stroke, he was 43. Like my father's heart attack. Yes. She stood with all of it for a moment, the shape of it, the architecture of a conspiracy that had apparently been running for the better part of 3 decades and had now, through a fabricated debt and a forced marriage, delivered her to the center of it. Why not just tell me, she said. Why not come to me and say, your father was murdered, he hid evidence, I need your help finding it. Why the performance? He looked at her steadily. Because you would have called the police. You don't know that. You're a paralegal. You work inside a legal framework. Your first instinct when threatened is to find the sanctioned response. I know this because I spent 6 weeks learning everything about you before I sent the letter. He paused. You would have called the police. The police in this city have 3 officers on active payroll with 2 of the families in those records. The information would have been in hostile hands within 48 hours, and you and your brother would have been dead within 72. She held his gaze for a long time. The terrible thing, the thing she could not quite forgive herself for, was that the logic was sound. She hated that the logic was sound. She wanted to find the flaw in it badly enough that she went through it twice and couldn't. This doesn't make it right, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. So she didn't speak to him for 2 days. She stayed in her room, which was now the room adjacent to his, and she was aware of him on the other side of the connecting door in the way you become aware of things you can't stop thinking about. A constant low-frequency knowledge. He didn't knock. He sent meals to the room and didn't expect her to come down, which was either respect for her anger or more management. She hadn't decided. On the second day, Danny called. She'd been given a phone chip. She had always had a phone, but this was a second one, a secure line. And Danny's voice on it sounded more normal than she expected, which meant he was working at sounding normal, which meant he was scared. There are 2 guys outside the apartment, he said. I know, they're there for your safety. They don't feel like safety, they feel like surveillance. Both things can be true simultaneously. A pause. Are you okay? She looked at the ceiling of the room. I've been better. Serena. His voice dropped. I've been thinking about what you said. About Dad. And I went through some of his old email. Before they shut the account down, I'd screenshotted some things. I don't know why, just he was my dad, and I wasn't ready to let go of stuff. There's an email from someone named GS sent about a month before he died. It says, don't let them find the second one. The numbers in the book are the map, but not the territory. She sat up. The second one, she said. Yeah, I don't know what that means. She did. Or she was beginning to. The notebook had 43 rows, years 1994 through 2021. But some of those years were missing. 2009, 2013, 2017, gaps of 4 years each, too regular to be accidental. The notebook wasn't the complete record. It was half of it. The other half existed somewhere else, and together they formed something complete. Danny, she said carefully, I need you to think, in the last year or 2 before Dad died, did he ever give you anything to keep? Anything that seemed random or didn't make sense at the time? The pause was long enough that she knew before he answered. He gave me a watch, Danny said. When I turned 18, said it was his father's. I thought it was just, it's a watch, Serena. It's a broken watch. I've had it in my desk drawer for 2 years. She closed her eyes. A broken watch. It had been in box 1. She'd held it, cataloged it, put it aside, moved on. Is it still in your desk? She said. Yeah. Don't touch it. Don't take it anywhere. I'm sending someone to get it today. She thought for a second. Actually, no. Bring it yourself. Come today if you can. The guys outside, tell them you're coming to see me. That's pre-approved. Just come. She hung up and looked at the connecting door for a moment, and then she knocked on it herself. Cassian opened it in under 10 seconds, which told her he had not been far from his side of it. My father hid a second set of records, she said. The notebook is half the evidence. There's a watch. It belonged to my grandfather. My father gave it to my brother 2 years before he died. I think the second record is inside it. Something moved across his face, rapid, tightly controlled. Your brother has it. He's bringing it today. A pause. That's good? She looked at him. I need access to your financial database. The accounts from the notebook. I want to cross-reference them myself. He studied her. Why yourself? Because I don't know yet who in your organization I can trust, and neither do you. His jaw tightened slightly. I'll set it up. She turned to go back to her room. Serena. It was the first time he'd used her name, not Mrs. Viscari, not Ms. Vale. Her name, said plainly, without performance. She stopped. I would have told you the truth eventually, he said, when it was safe enough. And when was that going to be? He didn't answer. That's what I thought, she said, and closed the door. Danny arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The watch was in his jacket pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief. Danny, who was 20 years old and owned 3 pairs of shoes and kept his room in a state that would have upset a structural engineer, had wrapped the watch in a handkerchief because he'd heard the urgency in her voice and decided to treat it accordingly. She loved him for that. She loved him in the specific, exhausting way of a person who has spent years being responsible for someone and can't stop. She took the watch to the library and looked at it under the lamp. It was a man's watch, silver, the kind that had been expensive once and was now simply old. The glass face was cracked along the bottom left corner. It didn't run. She turned it over. The back panel was attached with 2 small screws that were slightly, very slightly, newer than the casing. She recognized it the moment she saw it. The screws were the wrong era. The watch was from the 70s, possibly earlier. The screws were stainless steel, machine-threaded, contemporary. Her father had opened the back and resealed it. She got a letter opener from the desk and worked carefully, and eventually the panel came away. Behind it, folded impossibly small, was a strip of photographic film. Old-style negative film, the kind that predated digital by decades, approximately 20 frames. She held it up to the light. She could see images on it, documents, handwritten, columns of figures. But she needed equipment to read it properly, a film scanner or a darkroom, or at minimum a high-resolution light source and a macro lens. She went back through the connecting door without knocking. Cassian was on the phone. He ended the call when he saw her face. I need a film scanner, she said, and held up the strip. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. The scanner arrived within the hour. She didn't ask how. The images, once processed, were 21 photographs of handwritten ledger pages. They were in a language she didn't speak, not English, something Eastern European, possibly Romanian. But the numbers were numbers, and the numbers were dates and amounts and what appeared to be initials. She and Cassian sat side by side at the desk in his office, going through them, and she was aware of his breathing, steady, controlled, but different from usual, tighter. And she was aware that he recognized some of what he was seeing. These are from before I was born, he said. How do you know? The dates, 1981 through 1989. And this? He pointed to a set of initials repeated across 7 pages. AV. These are my father's initials. Aldo Vescari. She looked at him. My father built this organization, he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not grief, not anger, something older and more complex than either. He built it from nothing in this city, and he was killed for it when I was 11 years old. The official story was a rival organization. I have spent 20 years believing that story. He looked at the pages. These suggest the money that funded the organization that killed him came from accounts he himself had established, which means someone used his own resources to have him murdered, Serena said. Cassian was very still. Someone on the inside, she said. Someone who had been there from the beginning. Someone who knew the accounts, knew the structure, knew exactly where to apply pressure. She watched him get there. She watched the moment when the architecture of his understanding shifted, when 20 years of one story became something different, when the grief he had presumably long since sealed away cracked open at the seam, because the story it was based on had just been revised. "Lucien," he said. Not a question. She could see it in his face, the connections forming, the timeline resolving. Lucien Armand, who had been there since the beginning, who had helped build the empire, who had been 43 years old when Aldo Vescari died, and had presented himself to an 11-year-old orphan as family. "You don't know that yet," she said carefully. "No," he said. "But I'm going to find out." He found out in a way she hadn't anticipated, and it came apart in a way she hadn't planned for. 2 days later, she came back from her afternoon visit with Danny to find the east corridor blocked by 2 security personnel she'd never seen before. They directed her to the main hall without explaining why, and in the main hall she found Thierry standing with his hands clasped in front of him and a face that had gone back to the plaster neutrality of their first meeting. "Mr. Vescari is in a meeting," Thierry said. "Where?" "The lower study. It isn't—" She was already moving. She heard it before she reached the door. Not words, but the tone of a conversation that had crossed beyond discussion into something more elemental. She pushed the door open and stepped through it. Cassian was standing near the far wall with a gun in his hand. Lucien was against the wall itself. Not restrained, standing, upright, with his hands at his sides and his face composed into an expression of absolute calm that was, in that context, more frightening than fear would have been. "Serena," Cassian said, without looking at her. His voice was completely level. "Leave." "No," she said. A beat. She could see from across the room that he was working to keep himself together in a way she'd never seen him struggle with before. The muscle in his jaw, the positioning of his feet, the white-knuckled hand on the weapon. She looked at Lucien. Lucien looked back at her, and she saw it then. There, under the practiced warmth, something she hadn't had the context to identify the first time they'd met. Not cruelty. Patience. The patience of a person who had been waiting a very long time for something, and was, even now, not particularly concerned about the current moment. "He knows," Lucien said to her pleasantly, as if they were resuming a conversation. "I imagine you helped him work it out." "Lucien," Cassian's voice was a warning. "I'm not going to pretend, Cassian. There's no point. The girl has her father's records, and you've clearly had a look at them." Lucien shifted his weight slightly. Not toward the gun, just a settling. A person finding a more comfortable position. "It was always going to arrive here eventually. I had rather more time in my original timeline, but—" He glanced at Serena with something she could only describe as acknowledgement. "She was faster than I projected." "You had him killed," Cassian said. The sentence was made of something harder than anger. Harder and more structural, the language of a man stating a fact that is destroying something he's built his life around. "My father. Your father was going to make a decision that would have cost me everything I'd spent 15 years building," Lucien said. "He was a good man, genuinely, but good men in this business are a liability. And mine." The 2 words sat in the room. Lucien's expression didn't change. "Your parents were a consequence of the same decision. I'm sorry for that, truly. You were an intelligent child, and you grew into exactly what I needed you to become, which is—" He stopped. "A testament to your character. Not mine." Cassian raised the gun. "Cassian," Serena said. He didn't lower it. "If you shoot him here," she said, keeping her voice even, keeping it from becoming anything that would push what was already at the edge, "you lose the evidence. He knows what the records connect to and where the gaps are, and there are people in this organization who answer to him, not you. And if he dies tonight, those people disappear and you have documents in a language neither of us reads and no way to complete the case." She was crossing the room as she spoke. Steady, slow, the way you move around something that might bolt. She stopped beside Cassian, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the controlled ferocity of someone who wanted very badly to do one thing and was being asked by every rational part of himself to do another. "Don't," she said quietly. For him only. His breathing was audible. She'd never heard it before, his breathing, his actual physical breath. And it was the most human thing she'd encountered in this house. He lowered the gun. Lucien straightened his jacket cuffs. "Smart girl," he said. "Don't," she said to Lucien, and her own voice came out colder than she expected. He looked at her with what appeared to be genuine appreciation, which was the most unnerving expression she'd received since arriving. Security came and took him, and she stood in the study afterward with Cassian, and the room smelled like the candles that had been burning in here for hours. And she looked at the man beside her, who was not calm, who was as far from calm as she'd seen him, who was standing very still in the way of someone who is holding themselves together by force. And she didn't know what to say. She put her hand on his arm. He looked down at it. She felt him exhale, slow, deliberate, the specific exhalation of someone returning to themselves from a long distance. "The records aren't enough," he said finally. "Not as they are." "No," she agreed. "We need the translation. And we need someone who can authenticate them in front of every family that Lucien has been manipulating. He'll have planned for this. If he anticipated the records being found, he planned for you to find them alone," she said. "He didn't plan for me." Cassian looked at her. She looked back. "He built this entire situation," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "The debt, the marriage, bringing me inside. You said he helped you build the organization. Did he know what you were planning when you came to me?" The expression on Cassian's face changed. The shift was small, but it went through his whole face. "He suggested it," Cassian said. Serena heard the implication of that land in the room between them. She felt it hit. "He suggested I marry you," Cassian said, and his voice had a quality now she'd never heard. The sound of someone who understands they have been walked into something, that the board they've been playing on was never the real board. He said a legal wife would provide social protection during the diplomatic events. He identified you specifically. He made the case. She was very still. "He knew about my father's records," she said. "Yes." "And he knew I was the only one who could access them." "Yes." "So he built a situation where you would bring me inside, where I would find the records on your behalf, and where—" She stopped. "He needed the records found. He needed to know where they were and what they contained, and he needed someone he could frame for their disappearance after." Cassian's face had gone completely still in a new way. "He was going to let me find them," she said, "and then he was going to take them, and take me with them, because a missing wife is a much cleaner explanation than a burglary." She looked at him. "He didn't expect us to work together. He expected you to manage me, and I expected you to use me, and he planned on the gap between those two things." The room was absolutely silent. "He's been in custody for 40 minutes, Cassian said. "How many of your security personnel answer to him?" A pause that told her everything before he answered. "Too many," he said, and reached for his phone. It was already too late. The explosion was in the East Wing, not large, not structural, a concussive blast designed for distraction rather than destruction. And in the 12 seconds it took the house to respond, Lucien Armand walked out of custody with two men she'd never seen before and disappeared through the iron gate into the city with everything that had been on Cassian's desk when security had brought him through, including the film negatives, including at the window of the study and watched the gate close on the taillights of the car, and felt, for the first time since the door of her apartment came off its hinges, something she couldn't manage or contain or file for later. The only evidence that could bring down the people who had killed her father was gone. Her brother was somewhere in this building, and Lucien knew he existed. And the man standing behind her had been, from the first moment, both the person who had used her and the only possible resource she had left. She turned around. Cassian was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a long moment, and she understood, with the cold, clarifying precision of a person who has run out of safe positions, that the version of this situation where she was careful, where she maintained her distance, where she kept the currency of her trust locked away and issued it in measured amounts, was finished. What came next was going to require something she didn't know if she had left. The first thing Cassian did was find Danny. He didn't ask her if she wanted that. He just did it, picked up his radio and said 2 words, and inside of 4 minutes, a man she recognized from the ground floor appeared at the study door with Danny behind him. Danny, who was pale and still in his jacket from the afternoon visit, and who looked at Serena and then at the state of the room and said, "What happened?" "Change of plans," Serena said. "You're staying here tonight." "The explosion? I know. Oh, you're staying here." Danny looked at Cassian. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not trust, but the specific acknowledgement of two people who have a shared interest in the same person's survival. Danny gave a short nod and sat down on the study couch without further argument, which told Serena how frightened he actually was. Cassian had his phone to his ear. He was moving through the house with a controlled velocity she hadn't seen before. Not running, but close. The walk of a man who has shifted into an operational mode that ran underneath his usual precision like a current. She followed him, and he didn't tell her not to. Lucien took the physical evidence, she said, but I memorized the first set of numbers from the notebook. He glanced at her. All 43 rows, she said. I spent 2 days with it before I brought it to you. And I have photographs on the secure phone of 12 of the film negatives before the scanner finished processing. He stopped walking, turned and looked at her fully for the first time since the gate had closed on Lucien's taillights. You photographed the negatives. While you were making calls about the scanner, 12 of the 21, they're backed up to an account he doesn't know exists. She paused. It's not everything, but it's enough to begin a case if we can get it in front of the right people. Something shifted in his face, not relief, too controlled for that, but the adjacent thing. The recalibration of a situation that had looked completely lost toward something that was merely catastrophic. The right people, he said. Who do you mean? I mean the other syndicate leaders, the ones in those records, the ones Lucien has been stealing from for 20 years. She held his gaze. He planned the gala as the endgame. That's what the structure of those records suggested. A public moment, all the major families in one room, maximum audience for whatever he intends to do. If we can get there first, if we can put the evidence in front of those men before he controls the narrative. He'll have anticipated that, Cassian said. He anticipated us separately. He didn't anticipate us together. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. You said he suggested the marriage. He wanted me inside this house because I was the access point for the records. But he watched us through the lens of what he expected. You managing an asset, me resisting management. He didn't build his plan around the possibility that we'd actually... She stopped. Talk to each other, Cassian said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The gala is in 4 days. The Hartwell Estate, Upper Westchester. Every major family has a representative attending. It's an annual event, neutral ground by convention, no violence on the premises. Lucien arranged it? Lucien has arranged it for 11 years. She absorbed that. 11 years of an annual gathering. 11 years of Lucien in the room with every power player in the organization. 11 years of building relationships and trust and the particular authority of the person who controls the calendar. He's going to use it to take you down publicly, she said, in front of everyone whose respect you'd need to rebuild afterward. That's the plan. Not just to eliminate you, but to do it in a way that means whoever comes after you is already his. Cassian's jaw set. Yes. Then we go, she said, and we go with what we have. If the evidence isn't complete, it doesn't need to be complete. It needs to be enough to make the right people ask the right questions, and then let Lucien's own reaction confirm the rest. She held his eye. He'll panic. He's been patient for 30 years, but he's been patient in private. Put him in a room with 30 witnesses and evidence he thought he'd taken, and his reaction will do more damage than the documents. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. You're describing a very precise set of conditions that requires everything to go right, he said. Yes, she said. Do you have a better option? He didn't answer. That was its own answer. 4 days, he said finally. 4 days, she agreed. The preparation was not elegant. She spent the first day reconstructing the notebook from memory, writing the 43 rows into a new document on a laptop Cassian brought her that had never been connected to the estate's network. Her handwriting was small and precise, and she didn't stop except to drink coffee, and once, at 2 a.m, to stand at the window and breathe for approximately 4 minutes before sitting back down. Cassian sat across the desk for most of it, working his own parallel reconstruction, cross-referencing what she wrote against his own financial records, mapping the account numbers to known operations, building a timeline of Lucien's access and movement across 3 decades of the organization's history. They didn't speak much. The silence between them was different from the silence of the first weeks. It had a shared direction now, a common pressure. At 3:30 in the morning, he said without looking up, Your father chose the right person to give those records to. She kept writing. He didn't have a lot of options. He had more than you think. Soren knew other people. He chose Raymond Vale specifically because of his children. A pause. Because of you, specifically. There's a note in the original communication chain I found 14 months ago. Soren wrote, "He has a daughter who works with law. She will know what to do with this eventually." Serena stopped writing. She sat with that for a moment. Gabriel Soren, a man she'd never met, an accountant who'd worked for monsters and eventually couldn't anymore, writing her name into his contingency plan because her father had talked about her enough that she'd become someone's last hope without ever knowing it. She went back to writing. "He talked about us," she said. "My dad. To people. Constantly, apparently," Cassian said. There was something in his voice, not warmth, but something proximate to it, something careful and unexpected. "The transcripts I have of his conversations with Soren, he talked about you more than anything else." She did not look up from the page. She was not going to cry in front of this man in the middle of the night over something she couldn't do anything about. "Write faster," she said. She heard across the desk something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, stopped before it fully formed. They both kept working. On day 2-3 of Lucian's men made a move on the estate. It happened at 6 in the evening, when the light was going gray and the shift change on the perimeter created a gap. Small, expertly timed, the kind of gap that required inside knowledge to identify. 2 men came over the north wall. One came through a service entrance using a code that had been valid until 2 hours before, when Cassian's remaining loyal security had done a full rotation. They'd anticipated the service entrance. They hadn't fully anticipated the north wall, and the 30 seconds it took to redirect response gave the 2 men enough time to get to the ground floor east corridor before they were stopped. Serena was in the library when the shooting started. She heard it clearly. 3 shots, close together, then 1 isolated, then silence. She was already moving before the silence finished, toward the door, and the man Cassian had posted outside the library physically blocked her with his arm across the frame and said, "Stay inside, Ms. Vale." She stayed inside. Danny was beside her within seconds, having come from the adjacent sitting room at a run. He was holding a fireplace poker, which would have been almost funny under different circumstances. "What's happening?" he said. "Someone testing the defenses." "Testing?" He looked at the poker in his hand. "I'm going to need something better than this." "You're not going to need anything. Stay here." She stood at the library door and listened to the house until Cassian's voice came over the radio the guard outside was holding, and she heard him say, "Contained," and she let out a breath that took more out of her than she wanted to admit. He came to the library 20 minutes later. He had blood on his left sleeve, Not his, she thought. The angle was wrong. And his jacket was gone, and he looked like a man who had just finished something physically demanding and had not yet had time to process the adrenaline out of his system. "They were looking for the laptop," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "The man we detained said so, before he stopped being cooperative." His voice was flat. "Lucien knows you photographed the negatives." "How?" "The scanner logged the session. We didn't think to clear it before Lucian's people took it." A pause. "My oversight." She registered the admission. Cassian Viscari saying "my oversight," quietly and without deflection. And she filed it alongside the other things she'd been accumulating about this man that didn't fit the original construction. "So he knows we have partial evidence," she said. "Yes, which changes his timeline. He'll move the gala up if he can, or he'll make a move before it." Cassian was looking at her steadily. "We have less than 4 days, probably 2. Then we accelerate." "Serena, 2 days is enough." She said it with more certainty than she had, because certainty was the only currency available right now, and she was going to spend it. "I need the translation of the film negatives, the Romanian sections." "I have someone." "Get them here tonight." He got them there in 3 hours. A woman in her 60s named Vera, who arrived with a canvas bag and reading glasses, and the specific, unfazed quality of a person who had been asked to do unusual things at unusual hours for a very long time and had made her peace with it. She sat at the desk in the library and worked through the photographed negatives on the laptop screen with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she didn't ask what the documents were or why they mattered, and by midnight she had 17 pages of translated notes. Serena read them standing up, too restless to sit. The ledger pages were a record of payments made between 1981 and 1989 to what appeared to be 3 separate enforcement groups. For operations that were described in language she needed Vera to explain, but that amounted, once explained, to contract killings, territorial seizure, and the systematic elimination of rival operations. The amounts were enormous. The authorization signatures on each page were consistent, the same two initials on every entry, LA and one other. The other was RD, a set of initials she didn't recognize. She showed Cassian. He looked at them for a long time. Raphael Dumont, he said. He died in 1992. He was the co-founder of the organization with my father. A pause. I was told he died in a car accident. Lucien has a partner, she said. Had. Cassian's face was very still. If Dumont is dead, Dumont may be dead. His family isn't. She looked at the initials. Lucien needed a co-signer for the original operations, someone with equal authority, which means somewhere there's a Dumont who inherited that position and who has been backing Lucien's operations quietly for 30 years and who will be at the gala. The room went completely still. She watched Cassian work through it. She could track the calculation in the set of his jaw, the slight movement of his eyes as he mapped the implication outward. Lucien alone was a threat. Lucien, with a silent partner who had inherited both resources and motive, was something categorically different. We need to know who it is before we walk into that room, she said. Yes, he said, and we have 2 days. They didn't sleep much. She understood on the second day that the thing that had been building between them since the bathroom floor and the morning with the amber glasses and the long nights of shared work had become something she couldn't keep categorizing as purely operational. She wasn't ready to name it. Naming it felt like tempting something, like taking a hand off the wheel, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. He brought her coffee at 4 in the morning without being asked and set it beside her without saying anything, and she looked at his hand on the cup for a moment and then looked back at her work, and she heard him sit back down across the desk, and it was the most ordinary sequence of actions she'd experienced in 30-something days, and it nearly broke her. They found the Dumont heir through financial records. Cassian's own legitimate investment holdings overlapped, in 2 places, with a shell company that traced back through 4 layers to a family trust established in 1994 in the name of Isabelle Dumont, 54 years old, currently operating as a senior partner in a Zurich-based private equity firm with offices in New York. She'd been at every Hartwell Gala for 9 years. She sat on 2 charitable boards that Lucien chaired. She was Lucien's banker. She was his backstop. She was the reason he had survived every financial audit the organization had ever attempted. He was never going to bring you down at the gala, Serena said, reading through Isabelle Dumont's board memberships. Not just you. The plan is to present evidence that you've been embezzling from the families, manufactured evidence, framed against the accounts your father established. While Lucien positions himself and Dumont as the aggrieved parties who discovered the fraud. The families turn on you, you lose the organization, and Lucien takes control with Dumont's financial backing already in place. And if I try to defend myself, the evidence he's manufactured will be thorough. He's had 30 years to build it. She looked at him. Which is why we can't defend. We can only attack first. The gala invitation had come. Of course it had. The annual invitation that Cassian received as a matter of convention, because Lucien had apparently decided that having Cassian arrive to his own destruction was the cleaner option. There was a certain audacity to it that she understood, professionally, if not personally. They went the next evening. The Hartwell estate was 40 minutes north of the city, and it looked the way establishments look when money has been accumulating in one place for long enough that it stops being visible. The grounds were enormous and lit at intervals with the kind of lighting that costs more, the less it looks like it cost anything, and the cars on the drive ranged from conservative black sedans to things that suggested their owners had never once in their lives been concerned about a parking situation. Serena wore a dark green dress that someone had brought her, and she hadn't argued about it. She'd spent 20 minutes in front of the mirror in the adjacent room doing something she hadn't done in her entire adult life, which was deciding deliberately how she wanted to appear, what impression she intended to make, because impression was going to be a weapon tonight, and she was going to use it correctly. She looked like someone who belonged there. She didn't feel it. She felt like a 24-year-old paralegal from Astoria who had been inside a mafia estate for 37 days, and had approximately 4 hours to dismantle a 30-year conspiracy before the man who'd built it did the same to her and the person she had, despite every rational objection, started to want to protect. Cassian knocked on the connecting door at 7:15. She opened it. He looked at her once, briefly, with an expression that she catalogued and set aside for later. "Ready," she said. "Are you?" he said. "No. Let's go anyway." The ballroom was enormous, chandelier lit, already full when they arrived. She stayed beside Cassian and let him navigate the greetings. There were many, formal and brief, the choreography of people who understand that public interaction is performance. And she kept her face open and her posture easy, and she watched the room. She saw Lucien before he saw them. He was near the far end of the room with a woman she recognized from the photographs as Isabelle Dumont, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the particular stillness of someone who manages large amounts of money and has learned to convey security through sheer physical composure. Lucien had a glass of wine, and he was smiling at something Dumont was saying, and he looked like every version of himself she'd seen in the library that first afternoon. Warm, present, entirely comfortable. Then he saw them. The smile didn't disappear. That would have been the tell of an amateur. Instead it held, and his eyes made the adjustment that she'd been watching for, the microsecond recalculation of a man who had planned for Cassian's arrival and had not specifically planned for hers beside him, with a particular expression on her face. She smiled at him across the room. His wine glass moved to his other hand. "He's recalculating," she said, without moving her mouth much. "I see it," Cassian said. "Give me 10 minutes before you approach Rourke." Rourke was the eldest representative of the Calloway family, the most financially damaged by Lucian's skimming according to the record she'd reconstructed, and the most likely to respond to evidence with action rather than deliberation. "I want to be in position before Lucien realizes what we're doing." "Where will you be?" "With Dumont." His hand found her arm, brief and light. "Serena." 10 minutes, she said, and walked away from him into the crowd before he could finish. Isabelle Dumont was, up close, exactly what the photographs had suggested, composed and watchful, with the kind of face that didn't give much away, and the kind of eyes that were always assessing the room regardless of who they appeared to be looking at. She was standing alone for a moment, Lucien having moved to intercept Cassian, and Serena crossed the floor and stood beside her and said, "Mrs. Dumont, I'm Serena, Cassian's wife." Dumont looked at her with polite attention. "I know who you are, dear." "Good." Serena kept her voice pleasant. "Then you should know that I have photographs of your father's ledger pages from 1981 through 1989, with both his initials and Lucian's on every authorization. And you should know that those photographs are currently with 3 separate attorneys in 3 separate cities with instructions to file with federal prosecutors if I don't make a specific phone call by midnight tonight." Dumont's glass stopped on the way to her lips. "The accounts your father established," Serena continued, "are documented to the centés. The operations they funded are itemized. The Viscari organization's surviving victims are cataloged." She paused. "Lucien's plan for tonight involves presenting manufactured evidence against Cassian to these families and then watching them do his work for him. What he hasn't told you is that the manufactured evidence includes your family's name as co-conspirators in the embezzlement. He needs a secondary fall if the primary doesn't hold." Dumont set her glass down on the nearest tray. "That's a very bold claim." "I know. Would you like to see the photographs?" She had them on her phone. She'd thought about this, had thought about whether having physical evidence on her person in this room was a risk or a resource, and had decided resource, because the value of showing it here, now, to this specific woman, outweighed the risk of it being taken. Dumont looked at the photographs. She looked at them for a long time. When she looked up, the composure was intact, but something beneath it had shifted. A structural adjustment, the internal movement of a person who is revising their understanding of who in their life they can trust. "What do you want?" Dumont said. "I want you to stand in this room and say nothing when Cassian presents the evidence. I want you to let the case stand on its own." Serena held her gaze. "And when Lucien comes to you afterward, because he will, I want you to remember that he was willing to include your family name in his backup plan." She walked away before Dumont could answer. Cassian was near the center of the room, just beginning his approach to Rourke. She caught his eye across 40 feet of candlelit space and gave him a slight nod and watched him interpret it correctly and turned to the older man beside him. Then she felt a hand on her arm. Not Cassian's hand. The grip was harder, more deliberate, and when she turned, there were two men behind the hand and their faces said everything about what came next. "Mr. Armand would like a word," one of them said. She looked across the room at Cassian. I was looking back and he saw it and she saw him see it, and in the half-second before the men moved her toward the side corridor, she had time to understand that Lucien had split them deliberately, had waited for the moment they separated, had let her approach Dumont, had possibly even anticipated that she would, and had timed the next move precisely. The side corridor was quiet and dimly lit, and Lucien was already there. He still had his wine glass. He was still warm. "You're very good at this," he said. "I mean that genuinely. Your father would have been proud." She looked at him and kept her face even and breathed through the fear. Not panic, not the explosive kind, but the specific cold fear of someone who has identified exactly how much danger they are in and cannot pretend otherwise. "You brought us here," she said. "I facilitated your attendance, yes. I needed the evidence in this building, where I controlled the exits." He tilted his head. "Did you actually send those photographs to attorneys?" "Yes." "Midnight deadline?" "Yes." He smiled. "Then we have time." He set his wine glass on the hall table. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Cassian into this corridor. Not loudly, not in distress, calmly, as though you found something he needs to see. And when he comes, I'm going to present him with a choice that will be broadcast to every representative in that ballroom, which I've had wired for audio for the past 3 hours. He met her eyes. He surrenders operational control of the Vescari organization by written document, here and tonight, or they watch his wife die on a live feed. The corridor was very quiet. She could hear the ballroom beyond the doors, crystal and conversation, and the particular noise of power being social. You're going to broadcast my execution, she said. I'm going to broadcast his love for you, Lucien said. That's the point. Not your death. The fact that he'd do anything to prevent it. Nothing destroys a man's authority in this world faster than a room full of his enemies watching him kneel. He looked at her almost gently. You became his weakness the moment you stopped being just an asset. That happened around day 12, I'd estimate. The poisoning, the bathroom floor. He held your hair back, did you know that? The security footage was quite clear. She stared at him. He hadn't told her that. Cassian had never told her that. Call him, Lucien said. One of the men behind her had a hand at her back. She looked at the door to the ballroom. She thought about the photographs on her phone, the 12 frames out of 21, the partial record of a 30-year crime that was enough to begin a case but not enough to finish one. She thought about the 43 rows of numbers she carried in her memory. She thought about Danny in the estate with the door locked and 2 men she trusted outside it. She had to trust them. There was no alternative. And she thought about her father, who had kept a secret for 9 years in a broken watch and died for it alone in a motel room. She thought about Cassian, who had used her and who had told her the truth about using her and who had sat on a bathroom floor in the middle of the night and whose breathing she had memorized without meaning to. She did not call him. She did something else entirely. She turned to Lucien and said, You wired the ballroom for audio 3 hours ago. That means the feed started before we arrived. She looked at him steadily, which means everything I said to Isabelle Dumont is already on it. His expression shifted, barely, but she caught it. And everything you just said to me, she said, has been broadcasting to that room for the last 4 minutes. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man running very fast through a series of implications. Then the ballroom doors opened. Cassian stood in the doorway with Rourke beside him, and 6 other men she didn't know the names of yet. And the expression on Cassian's face was not relief, and it was not triumph. It was the face of a man who has been watching a screen in a room for 4 minutes, and has heard every word, and has been waiting for the precise moment to open a door, and who is looking at the woman in the corridor with something that is not calculation and is not management and is not anything she has a clean word for yet. Lucien looked at the men in the doorway. He looked at Serena. You had no way of knowing the room was wired, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost impressed. No, she said. But you did. And I knew you well enough by now to know you'd want an audience. She held his gaze. You always needed an audience, Lucian. That's the thing about you. You've been performing for 30 years, and the performance is the only part you actually love. Cassian crossed the corridor in 6 steps. He put himself between her and Lucian with a physicality that was not theatrical. Just placement, just the simple animal fact of a body deciding where it belongs. Lucian looked at him and at her and at the men filling the doorway behind Cassian, and whatever calculation he ran in the next 3 seconds told him the same thing. It was telling everyone else in the corridor. The board had turned, the audience was hostile, and the performance was over. He moved for the exit at the end of the hall. He was fast, faster than she expected for a man his age, the speed of someone who had planned an escape route as thoroughly as everything else. I was at the corridor's end door before Cassian's men reached him, and through it, and they heard his footsteps on the stairs going up rather than down, which meant he was going for the roof, which meant he had something waiting there. A car, a contact, a helicopter, something. Cassian looked at her. Go, she said. He went. She followed, because she had not come this far to stand in a hallway. The stairs were narrow and badly lit, and she took them 2 at a time, and her heart was doing something extreme in her chest. And she could hear Cassian ahead of her, and the men behind her, and the sound of the door at the top hitting the exterior wall as Lucian went through it, and then they were on the roof, and the night air hit her like something physical after the heat of the building below. It was raining. Not hard. A thin, cold rain that made the rooftop surface slick and turned the city lights below into something blurred and enormous. Lucian was across the roof near the parapet, and he was alone. Whatever he'd arranged up here hadn't materialized, or had been intercepted, or he'd miscalculated the timing. And he turned when they came through the door, and his face in the rain was the first honest version of it she'd seen. Not warm, not composed, something stripped down to its actual material. Cassian walked toward him, and the men fanned out. And Lucian had nowhere left to go, and he looked at them both. At Cassian, then at Serena, then back at Cassian. And something crossed his face that might have been, under different circumstances, genuine. She's better than you deserved, Lucian said. I know, Cassian said. Your father would have liked her. A pause, and in it something complicated moved across Lucian's face. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying guilt alongside justification for so long, the two have become indistinguishable. Aldo would have liked her. Don't say his name, Cassian said. The rain was heavier now. Serena's dress was soaked through and she was cold in a way that went past the surface, and she stood on the wet roof and watched the 2 men, the one who had shaped everything and the one who had been shaped by it, face each other in the rain, and she felt the exact weight of 30 years pressing down on the moment. It ends here, Cassian said. Lucian looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket. Not for a weapon, or maybe it was, depending on definition, but for a small drive, the kind that held files, that held records, that held the kind of accumulated documentation that a man who has been playing a long game keeps in physical form as insurance against the moment everything goes wrong. He held it up between 2 fingers. Everything, he said. 40 years. Every account, every operation, every name, yours and mine and Dumont's, and every family represented in that ballroom tonight. He looked at the drive and then at Cassian. This is what your father died for, proof that the whole machine was rotten from the beginning. His voice had changed. Something genuine in it now, something that surprised her even now. I hated him for it, for being the one person I couldn't make understand that the machine had to be rotten, that there was no other kind. He dropped the drive. It hit the wet rooftop and slid toward the parapet. Cassian moved for it at the same instant that Lucian moved for the edge, and everything that happened in the next 4 seconds happened simultaneously. Cassian's hand closing on the drive as he went to his knees on the slick surface. Serena crossing the roof faster than she knew she could move. Lucian's foot on the parapet ledge, not in despair but in intent. The intent of a man who has decided that capture is not an outcome he is willing to accept, and the men on the roof moving and shouting and the rain making everything heavier and harder. She reached Lucian first. Not Cassian. Her. She grabbed his arm with both hands, and the shock of it, of being grabbed by her, specifically, the woman he'd underestimated from the beginning, made him hesitate for exactly the second required. Cassian was behind her, His hand came over hers on Lucian's arm, and the three of them stood at the parapet edge in the rain, connected by grip and history and 30 years of accumulated damage. And Lucian looked at them both, and the warmth was completely gone. And what was left was something she had no category for. Exhaustion, maybe, or the specific ruin of a man who has achieved everything he planned and found it was not what he thought. "It's over," she said. Lucian looked at her hand on his arm, then he stepped back from the ledge. The men moved in. Cassian stood on the wet rooftop with the drive in one hand and looked at Serena, and she looked back at him. And she was soaked through and shaking, and her shoes were ruined, and her heart was doing something she could feel in her throat. And below them in the Hartwell ballroom, 30 of the most dangerous people in the city were listening to a recording that had just changed everything. She looked at Cassian's hand, the one holding the drive, the knuckles scraped raw against the rooftop surface when he'd gone down for it. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move. She took his hand carefully, turned it over, looked at the damage in the low light. It was not serious. It was also not nothing. She held it, and he let her, and the rain came down around them, and the city below was enormous and indifferent, and she stood on a rain-soaked roof with a man she'd married to save her brother's life, and held his bleeding hand and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic, that she was in significant trouble of a kind that had nothing to do with Lucien Armand. "We still have to go back down there," she said. "Yes." 30 families, all their lawyers, federal implications. "Yes." "That's going to take a long time," he said. "Yes." She let go of his hand. She looked at the door back into the building, at the men moving Lucian toward it, at the rain-soaked roof and the city below, and the 12 photographs on a phone in her ruined bag, and the 43 rows of numbers in her memory, and everything that still needed to be done. And she took one breath that was just for herself, just hers, not for any audience, not for any calculation. Then she walked toward the door. Behind her she heard Cassian follow. And below them, in the ballroom of the Hartwell estate, the recording played on, and the room that had been assembled for her destruction was becoming one silence at a time, something entirely different from what Lucien Armand had spent 30 years building toward. And the machine that had run on fear and performance and the patience of a man who needed an audience was grinding, finally, to its overdue end. But the last piece was not yet finished, and the morning that was coming would require both of them to be something they hadn't entirely become yet. Standing in the rain with blood on his hand and everything she'd ever believed about her own life rewritten down to the foundation. The ballroom was quieter than it had any right to be. 31 people stood or sat in various states of reassessment when Cassian came back through the doors, and the recording that had been playing through the room's speakers had ended approximately 4 minutes earlier, and what followed that ending was the specific silence of a room full of dangerous people who have just had their understanding of the last decade revised against their will and are working through the implications. Serena came in behind him. She was aware of the eyes, all of them, the cataloging, the measurement, the particular attention of people who trade in information and were currently processing a significant update. She was wet, and her dress was wrong for the state she was in, and she had not slept properly in 4 days. And she walked into that room beside Cassian Viscari and kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she looked at no one specific, and everyone generally, which was a thing she had learned in 37 days inside his world. Rourke was the first one to speak. I was a large man, 70s, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard and come out the other side into something like granite. He looked at Cassian and then at the door behind which Lucian had been taken, and he said, "How long?" "The accounts?" 14 months confirmed. Cassian's voice was level, the operational calm she'd come to understand as his working register. The original operations, the ledger records indicate 1981 through 1989 as the documented period, but the financial structuring suggests the mechanism was in place earlier. And the Dumont woman. Inherited position, passive until recently. He paused. She has not been actively hostile tonight. Rourke looked at Serena then. Not aggressively, more like a man recalibrating something. She's the one who brought the evidence. Her father preserved it, Cassian said. She retrieved it. The distinction was Cassian's way of crediting Raymond Vale, and she understood it as such, and she did not look at him when she understood it because the room was not the place. "The question," said a woman near the far window. She was perhaps 60, dark-suited, with a Spanish accent and eyes that had been doing arithmetic since before Serena walked in, is what you intend to do with the documentation. File it, Cassian said, through channels that don't run through anyone in this room. The accounts, the operations, the authorization signatures, everything that can be verified independently will be. That exposes all of us, said a man to Rourke's left. It exposes Lucien and Dumont, Cassian said. The ledger records are specific. If your name isn't in them, you have nothing to fear from them being filed. The room processed that. Serena watched the faces, the ones who were visibly relieved, the ones who kept very still, the one man in the back who had already reached for his phone and was being quietly, efficiently intercepted by two of Cassian's people before he could complete a call. That interception was smooth enough that half the room didn't notice it, which told her that Cassian had placed those people before they came in here, that he had planned the re-entry with the same precision he'd applied to everything else, and that what looked like improvisation tonight was, at its framework, prepared. She wondered when he'd slept last. She wondered when she had. Isabelle Dumont was still in the room. She was standing near the window she'd been at when Serena first approached her, and her wine glass was gone, and her hands were clasped in front of her, and she looked like a woman who has been told her parachute has a problem at 40,000 feet and is deciding, with extraordinary composure, how to think about that. She met Serena's eyes across the room. Serena held the look. Dumont gave a very slight nod, barely a movement, more like the intention of one, and Serena understood it as, I heard what you told me about Lucien's backup plan. I have decided what to do with that information, and it will not involve protecting him. The rest of the evening was logistics, which was its own form of brutal. They left the Hartwell estate at 1:15 in the morning. Not in the black Mercedes. That vehicle had been swept and cleared twice in the last week, and she still didn't entirely trust it, which was a level of operational paranoia she acknowledged, was possibly excessive and maintained anyway. They left in an unmarked car driven by a man named Hector, who had been with Cassian for 11 years and who drove with the specific focused quiet of someone who understands that the people in his back seat have just been through something and doesn't require conversation about it. She sat beside Cassian, and they didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. The city materialized around them as they came back south. The lights, the noise, the enormous indifference of it. And she watched it through the window and let herself, for the first time in 4 days, stop running through contingencies. There was nothing left to contingency. What was done, and what came next was paperwork and legal process and the slow machinery of consequence. And that machinery was in motion and could not be stopped, and for tonight that had to be enough. The drive, she said finally. He had it in his jacket pocket. He'd had it since the roof. Vera can work through it, she said. The full record, cross-referenced with what I memorized from the notebook. Yes. It'll take time to authenticate. Several months, probably. And Lucien's legal team will file immediately. Also, yes. She turned her head and looked at him in the dark of the car. I was looking forward, at the back of Hector's head, or at the road beyond it, or at nothing in particular, and his profile in the passing light was tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not physically, though that too, but in the deeper sense of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just put it down and is feeling the absence of the weight before he feels the relief. What happened with your parents, she said. Lucien's confession on the roof. Is that enough? A pause. For a legal case? No. For my own knowledge? He was quiet for a moment. I've known for years that the official account was incomplete. I didn't know who or how. Now I do. Another pause. That's its own kind of finished. She understood that. The specific completion of finally knowing a thing you'd been carrying as a question. My father, she said. The full picture. Do we have enough to prove what was done to him? The pattern is there. The method matches what we have documentation for in 2 other cases from the same period. It won't be a simple prosecution. He finally turned his head and looked at her. But it will be one. She nodded, turned back to the window. He talked about you, Cassian said. Constantly, apparently. To Soren, to anyone who would listen. He called you the most capable person he'd ever known and said he was sorry he didn't know how to tell you that while he was alive to say it. She kept her eyes on the glass. I found the transcripts 14 months ago, he said, when I started building the case. I sat with that for a long time before I decided how to approach you. And you decided on a fabricated debt and a kidnapping. I decided on the most efficient available method, he said. I'm not telling you it was right. No, she said. You're not. Hector drove. The city moved past. He would have liked you, she said, finally. Not in response to anything specific, just a thing that was true and that she was saying because it deserved to be said. My dad. He had terrible judgment about most things, but his read on people was usually accurate. She paused. He would have liked you, and it would have annoyed him enormously. Something moved in Cashin's expression that might have been, in another man, in another life, a smile. Wow. Danny was awake when they got back. Of course he was. He was 20 years old, and someone had blown up a section of the building 2 days ago, and his sister had gone to a formal event in Westchester dressed like someone going to war. He was in the main hall sitting on the bottom of the staircase in his socks. And when Serena came through the door, he stood up and crossed the floor and hugged her before she could say anything, which she allowed, because she was tired and he was her brother, and some things don't require explanation. It's done? He said into her hair. It's done. She pulled back and looked at him. He had their father's eyes. She'd always known it, had spent years avoiding the knowledge because it complicated her feelings about Raymond Vale to find him every time she looked at her brother. She let herself know it now. You're going back to Queen's College in the fall. Serena. The arrangement includes resources. You're going to finish your degree and you're going to stop bussing tables and you're going to be fine. He looked past her at Cassian, who had stopped near the doorway with the exhausted stillness of a man who is giving other people space because he understands it's required. Thank you, Danny said. To Cassian. Direct and simple, the way 20-year-olds manage sincerity when they stop trying to manage it. Cassian gave a short nod. Danny looked between them for a moment, reading whatever was there to read, which she suspected was considerable, and then he said, I'm going to bed, and went up the stairs with the diplomatic withdrawal of someone smarter than he usually let on. She stood in the hall and listened to his footsteps overhead. Then she walked past Cassian toward the study, and he followed, and she poured 2 glasses of the amber thing. She knew where it was now, had known for weeks, and handed him one and sat on the couch instead of the chair across the desk, which was the first time she'd done that, and after a moment he sat beside her. They drank. The house was very quiet. The contract, she said after a while. What about it? It's been, she counted backward, 39 days. Yes. 12 months was the term. Yes. There's a lawyer you use for legitimate filings. I've heard his name enough times to know he handles things quickly when required. Cassian held his glass and looked at the far wall. You want to discuss the contract at 1:45 in the morning. I want to know, she said, whether it's still the contract we're operating under. He turned his head and looked at her. Because if it is, she said, then in approximately 10.5 months, I'm going to leave this house and go back to my apartment in Astoria or somewhere else and live whatever life comes after this. And that's a legitimate outcome of a legitimate agreement, and I will have honored the terms. She paused. But if there's something else operating, she stopped, found the words that were accurate and used them. I'd rather know what it is than spend 10 months pretending it isn't there. The room held them both for a moment. Cassian set his glass down on the table. He turned toward her, not fully. The angle of a person who is being careful about something, who is approaching it at a considered pace. I knew the contract had become legally unenforceable approximately 3 weeks in, he said. A technicality in the initial filing. The debt structure was fabricated, which meant the legal basis for the arrangement had a foundational flaw that any competent attorney would find immediately. He paused. I didn't tell you. She looked at him. You could have released me. Yes. But you didn't. No. Why? He held her gaze without deflection. This was the thing about him. Whatever else was true, he didn't evade the direct questions. It was the only consistent form of respect he'd offered her since the beginning, and she had come to value it more than she'd expected. Because by the time I knew, he said, the reasons I had for wanting you to stay had changed. She held that. They had changed in ways, he continued carefully, that I didn't have the language for, in the context we were operating in. You were an asset I'd brought into a dangerous situation under coercive terms, and anything I felt in addition to that was, he stopped, not something I was willing to use as leverage. So you said nothing. So I said nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was low and the house was quiet and the city outside was doing its permanent background thing. And she looked at this man who had sat on her bathroom floor and held her hand while she slept and told her the truth when it cost him something and put himself between her and a gun in a Westchester corridor. And she thought about all the words she had for what that added up to and found none of them entirely sufficient. That was, she said, both considerate and completely maddening. I know. You should have told me. Probably. I would have... She stopped. Would have what exactly? Would have left? Maybe. Would have stayed? She didn't know. That was the honest answer, which was its own information. I would have liked to choose, she said. Yes, he said. That was the problem. I didn't want to hand you the choice until I was certain you had enough information to make it without the pressure of everything else we were in the middle of. And now? He reached into his jacket. She expected the drive. She'd half forgotten it. But it wasn't the drive. It was a piece of paper folded twice, which he unfolded and held out to her. It was the marriage contract, the original, on the estate's legal letterhead, with both their signatures at the bottom and the witnesses' names and the date that now felt like it belonged to a different chapter of her life. She took it. He was quiet while she looked at it. Then he said, I had that in my desk for 2 weeks before tonight. I kept meaning to, He stopped. It was never the right moment. Because of Lucien. Because of Lucien. Because of the evidence. Because every time I thought about putting it in front of you, I was also going to have to say things I didn't have the... He looked at his hands. Things that required more than I had available in the middle of a crisis. And now the crisis is over. The immediate one. She looked at the contract, at her own signature, written in the study on the night he'd told her about her father, signed with the kind of deliberate steadiness that she'd forced because she refused to let her hand shake in front of him. She tore it in half, then in half again and again, until the pieces were small enough to hold in a closed palm. She opened her hand and looked at them. That was your copy, he said. I know. Mine is in the filing. I know that too. She closed her hand on the pieces. File the dissolution whenever you're ready. I'll sign whatever's required. The room was quiet for a moment. Is that what you want? He said. She looked at him. Is that what you're asking me? Whether I want the marriage dissolved. He met her eyes. He didn't look away, and he didn't recalculate, and he didn't give her the flat, operational expression that had been his armor for 6 weeks. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the rooftop, directly, without management. Yes, he said. That's what I'm asking. She let out a slow breath. She thought about Astoria, about the apartment and the kitchen counter covered in mail, and the job she'd gone back to tomorrow mornings for 4 years running, and the life she'd been building brick by brick since she was 19 and understood that no one was going to build it for her. She thought about what it had cost to construct that life, and what it had cost to walk away from it on a Tuesday night when the door came off the hinges, and what she was now, what version of herself had come through the last 39 days, and whether that version fit the life she'd been building or whether the life needed revision. Not yet, she said. He was very still. I'm not saying yes to any particular future, she said clearly, because clarity mattered and she was not going to be imprecise about this. I'm saying I'd like to make the choice from a position that isn't either coercion or crisis, and we haven't been in that position until approximately tonight. She looked at him steadily. So, not yet. Something moved through his face, not relief exactly, not triumph, nothing so simple, something that looked like a person setting down a weight they'd been carrying at arm's length for weeks. All right, he said. That's not a promise, she said. I know. I'm fully capable of deciding in a month that the answer is no. I know that too. She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at the pieces of the contract in her hand, and she got up and walked to the fireplace and put them in what was left of the fire and watched them catch. 3 weeks later, Lucien Armand's legal team filed 17 motions. It was, everyone agreed, an impressive opening response for a man who had confessed to 4 decades of organizational crime on a live audio feed in front of 30 witnesses, 2 of whom had already agreed to cooperate with the subsequent federal inquiry. Serena read the filings in the study on a Tuesday morning with coffee she'd made herself. She'd figured out the kitchen by week 5, to the visible discomfort of the household staff who didn't know what to do with her, and made notes in the margins and then wrote a 12-page memo to Cassian's lead attorney outlining the evidentiary problems with 6 of the 17 motions. The attorney called her 2 hours later. "This is thorough," he said. "I'm a paralegal," she said. "It's what I do." A pause. "We could use someone with this kind of attention to the Lucian matter specifically. The documentation is complex and requires someone who knows the full history." She looked out the window at the estate grounds. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for approximately 30 seconds. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." Isabelle Dumont cooperated fully with the federal inquiry. This was not a surprise to Serena, who had stood in the ballroom corridor and watched Dumont absorb the information about Lucian's backup plan and had seen, in the specific tightening of that composed face, the moment a 54-year-old woman decided that loyalty has limits, and those limits had been reached. Dumont's cooperation opened 12 years of financial records that were, according to the lead federal investigator, the most comprehensive documentation of organized financial crime he'd encountered in 23 years of practice. It was also not lost on anyone that Dumont's cooperation saved her from the most significant criminal exposure, which was exactly what Serena had implied it would do when she'd laid out the math in the ballroom corridor, and which was either admirable pragmatism or cold calculation depending on your perspective, and Serena had decided she could hold both without resolving the contradiction. The trafficking network was the piece that took longest. It had been embedded in 3 of Lucian's legitimate business entities, structured as labor contracting and dissolved into accounting entries that looked, to a cursory review, like ordinary operational costs. Serena found it in week 6 of working the documentation, found it at 11:30 on a Wednesday night when she was alone in the study with the drive's content spread across 2 screens, and she sat with it for 10 minutes before she called Cassian in from wherever he was. He came immediately. He always came immediately, which she had stopped noting as notable. She showed him the entries. He read them twice. His jaw did the thing it did when something landed that he needed to process before he could respond. "How many?" he said. "The records go back 8 years. I can't give you a number yet." "Estimate." "Hundreds." She paused. "Possibly more." He stood with that. She watched him hold it, the weight of it, the specific enormity of having built and run an organization that had, somewhere in its structure, contained this without his knowledge, or at least without his clear knowledge, which was the thing she still didn't have complete certainty about, and which she had decided, after considerable internal argument, to take on faith for now. "I need to know," she said carefully, "whether you knew this was in there." He looked at her. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, "whatever it is." "I knew the organization had done things I didn't sanction," he said. "I knew Lucien had extended operations beyond my authority. I did not know the specifics." A pause. "I should have known. I had the resources to know, and I chose, at points, not to look too closely." She held his gaze. "That's honest. It's the truth. It's going to be part of the federal record." "Yes," he said. "It should be." She looked at him for a long moment. He stood there and let her look. Didn't deflect, didn't qualify, didn't fill the silence with anything that would have made it easier. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They worked until 3 in the morning. The conversation with Danny happened on a Saturday in early spring. He'd come back to the estate for what had become a weekly pattern. Not because he was required to, the arrangement had long since become something other than its original terms, but because he'd decided on his own that he liked coming, which Serena had registered and not commented on. He and Cassian had developed a relationship she hadn't engineered and hadn't anticipated, brief, practical, occasionally punctuated by Danny asking questions about things that Cassian answered without condescension, which was apparently all Danny had ever required from an adult male in his proximity. They were in the kitchen that Saturday, the 3 of them, which still occasionally stopped her when she became aware of it as a composition. And Danny was eating cereal at the counter and reading something on his phone, and Cassian was going through paperwork at the table, and she was making coffee she didn't yet need, and Danny looked up and said without apparent segue, "Are you guys going to stay married?" The kitchen was briefly very quiet. "Danny," she said. I'm just asking. He looked between them. Because it seems like you are, but nobody has said so, and I want to know what I'm looking at. Cassian looked up from his paperwork. He looked at Danny, and then at Serena, and then, with the deliberate pace of a man who chooses his moments carefully, he waited. She turned it around and looked at her brother. We're figuring it out, she said. That's politician talk. That's the actual answer. Danny considered this. Does figuring it out mean maybe, or does it mean yes, but slowly? She looked at Cassian. He looked back at her. Yes, but slowly, she said. Danny nodded like this confirmed something he'd already concluded. Okay. He went back to his phone. Just checking. The kitchen went back to its Saturday morning sounds. She turned back to the coffee and let the thing that was in her chest sit there. The specific warmth of a morning that had no crisis in it, no deadline, no evidence to reconstruct or case to build or threat to calculate. Just a kitchen and two people she had not expected to have in her life. And the entirely ordinary, extraordinary fact of being somewhere she had chosen. The formal dissolution of the Vescari criminal organization took 14 months. There were legal proceedings in 3 jurisdictions, a federal inquiry that ran concurrently with a parallel investigation opened by the state attorney's office, and a restructuring process that Cassian undertook with the same precision he applied to everything, methodically, without sentiment, accepting every consequence that came with the territory, while fighting every consequence that came from someone else's crime being attributed to his. Serena worked the documentation through all of it. She did it first as a consultant to the lead attorney, and then, 6 months in, as something more formally defined, a position that required her to pass a background inquiry that was, given the last year and a half of her life, one of the more surreal experiences she'd had, which was saying something. The paralegal firm in Lower Manhattan sent a nice email when she resigned. Lucien Armand went to trial in the fall. He arrived at the courthouse each day in a suit and looked, as he always had, like a person who was comfortable with his circumstances, which Serena suspected was neither performance nor delusion, but simply how a man built like Lucien experienced the world. Always the one who understood more than the room, always slightly ahead of the consequence. He was not acquitted. He received a sentence that the press characterized as substantial, and that Serena characterized privately as arithmetically insufficient given the scope of what the evidence documented. But she had been working with lawyers long enough to know that the law's relationship with justice was approximating rather than exact, and she held what she got. She was in the gallery when the verdict was read. Cassian sat beside her. When the room rose for the judge's exit, she felt him take her hand, not the staged hand-holding of the early weeks, not the grip of a man moving her out of a bullet's path, but something quieter and more deliberate, the hand of a person sitting beside you because that is where they have decided to be. She held it. Her father's case was resolved 11 months after Lucien's sentencing. The charges were posthumously filed, a procedural mechanism that existed for exactly this kind of situation, where the act could be proven and the actor identified, but the victim was no longer living to testify. The documentation from the drive combined with Dumont's cooperation and 3 additional witnesses produced a case that the prosecutor told Serena, the day before the filing, was among the cleanest she had assembled in 15 years. Serena sat in the prosecutor's office on the 14th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan and listened to this and nodded and said the professional things that the moment required. And then she drove back to the estate and went up to the roof. The estate's own roof, not the Hartwell roof, a different roof, flat and gray, and surrounded by the city's skyline. And she stood up there alone for a while. She'd told Cassian where she was going, and he'd understood, which was one of the things about him she'd accumulated into something important. The understanding without the requirement to be included in it. She stood on the roof and thought about Raymond Vale. Not the father she'd been angry at. Not the father she'd revised upward. The actual one, imperfect, frightened, probably lonely, who had worked the jobs that were available to him and told people about his daughter more than he told her he was proud of her, and who had kept a terrible secret in a broken watch for 9 years because someone he trusted told him it was the only way to keep his children safe, and who had died in a motel room outside Newark having never told anyone any of it. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't not angry either. She was something past both, in the territory that doesn't have a clean name, where you've processed something so thoroughly it's become part of the structure of you rather than a thing you're carrying. She stayed on the roof until the light changed. When she came back downstairs, Cassian was in the study at his desk, doing the thing he was always doing: the paperwork, the filings, the endless administrative work of transforming a criminal organization into something legitimate, which was, he had told her once, primarily an exercise in creating paper trails that obscure what the paper trails replace. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him, not in the chair across the desk, on the desk itself, which was new, which she did because she was tired of furniture arrangements that implied she needed a barrier. He looked at her sitting on his desk with an expression she'd stopped trying to parse and started simply accepting as his version of warmth. "It's filed," she said. "I know. The prosecutor called." "She called you?" "You listed me as next of kin in the case documentation." He paused. "Possibly an error." "Possibly not," she said. He held her gaze. She held his. Outside the study window, the estate grounds were going dark. The early dark of a late autumn evening, the trees stripped down to structure, the wall at the perimeter just visible against the sky. It was not the same view as the Astoria apartment. It was not the skyline she'd grown up orienting herself by, the fixed coordinates of her ordinary life. It was where she was. She reached into her jacket pocket and put something on the desk between them. It was a ring, not the one he'd produced at their wedding, not the original piece which had been returned to whatever storage it came from shortly after she'd moved to the adjacent room. This one she'd bought herself 3 weeks ago from a jeweler in the West Village. A simple thing, a band, chosen because she had decided that if there was going to be a ring, she wanted to choose it, and she'd chosen something that looked like a decision rather than a decoration. He looked at it on the desk. "I know you had something else in mind for this moment," she said. "Something with more ceremony, probably. A better setting." "I had a roof in mind," he said. "A specific one." The Hartwell roof was not the romantic experience you seemed to be retaining it as. "You held a man back from the edge and told him he'd been performing for 30 years. I found it notable." "That's—" She looked at him. "That's a very specific thing to find romantic." "I didn't say romantic. I said notable." She looked at the ring between them. "Cassian," she said. "Serena. I'm going to continue being difficult about everything. I'm aware. I'm going to keep working the case files, independently, with my own judgment about what to file and when. I would expect nothing else. And I need Danny to be able to come here whenever he wants. That's non-negotiable." "He already does." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not the person I was when I walked through your door." "No," he said. "Neither am I." She picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers, the simple band, the plain thing she'd chosen because it looked like a decision. And she held it for a moment and thought about the woman who had stood in a study 6 months ago and heard the word wife in a man's voice and felt it land strangely because it was attached to nothing real. It wasn't attached to nothing now. She put it on. He watched her do it, and he didn't move and he didn't say anything, and she looked at her own hand and looked at him. And the quiet in the room was the best kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a standoff, not the quiet of two people managing each other, but the quiet of a shared arriving. Two people who had come through something and put it down and were now, at last, in the same place at the same time without an agenda. He reached across the desk and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with anything that wanted to be witnessed, just the simple grounding fact of holding it. She looked at their hands. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. Outside, the city was doing its permanent thing, loud and alive and completely indifferent, the way cities are, the way they've always been. And inside the study, the fire was low, and the paperwork was stacked, and the man who had once ruled through fear was sitting with his hand in hers, and the woman who had walked in with nothing but her wits and her father's secret had built, out of the wreckage of 39 terrible and clarifying days, something she had not planned for and could not have engineered. Something real. Not finished. Nothing real is finished. It just continues. Not perfect, because perfection is for people who haven't been through anything yet. But solid and chosen and hers. She thought about her father, one last time, Raymond Vale, who had said she was the most capable person he'd ever known and hadn't known how to tell her. She thought, "I found it, Dad. Whatever you hid. I found all of it." She held Cassian's hand and watched the fire and let the evening settle around them, and the story that had started with the door coming off its hinges closed, finally, on something quieter than any of what came before. A room, a fire. Two people with their histories showing, choosing, in the simplest possible terms, to stay.